The first bullet struck the ground at Heath Simmons' feet, kicking up a spray of dust that speckled his worn leather boots. The second shot whizzed past his ear, close enough that he felt the air displace around the lead. By the time the third shot rang out, Heath was already diving behind the water trough, his heart hammering against his ribs like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. "Damn it all," he muttered, clutching his Colt revolver with white knuckles. The year was 1878, and Heath Simmons had just made the worst mistake of his life, falling in love with Nancy Marshall, the only daughter of Judge Elijah Marshall, the most powerful man in Silver Creek County, Arizona Territory. The fourth bullet splintered the wooden trough above his head, sending a cascade of tepid water down his already sweat-soaked shirt. "Come out, you yellow-bellied son of a coyote." The voice belonged to Randall Pike, the man Nancy had been promised to before Heath had entered the picture. "I'm gonna fill you with more holes than a prospector's sieve." Heath checked his ammunition, 5 bullets left. Not nearly enough if Pike had brought his usual gang of miscreants. He glanced toward his horse tethered on the far side of the street. Too far, he'd be cut down before he made it halfway. "You've got 10 seconds, Simmons," Pike called. "Then we're coming after you." A movement from the milliner's shop across the street caught Heath's eye. Nancy stood in the doorway, her chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her green eyes wide with fear. She gestured frantically toward the alley beside the building. "An escape route. 5 seconds." Heath nodded at Nancy, took a deep breath, and prepared to run. But before he could move, the unexpected sound of a shotgun being cocked echoed through the dusty street. "That'll be quite enough, Mr. Pike." Sheriff William Thompson stepped out from the saloon, his double barrel aimed squarely at Pike's chest. "Lower that iron or I'll ventilate your waistcoat." Pike hesitated, his face contorted with rage, but after a tense moment, he holstered his weapon. "This ain't over, Simmons," he spat. "Not by a long shot." As Pike and his men retreated, Heath caught Nancy's eye across the street. Her smile was like a cool drink after a day in the desert sun, relief, joy, and something deeper that made his heart skip. Later that evening, as the desert sky transformed from blue to pink to deep purple, Heath and Nancy met at their secret place, an abandoned homesteader's cabin a mile outside of town. "You shouldn't have come to town today," Heath said as he pulled Nancy into his arms. "It's too dangerous." "Your father's men are everywhere." Nancy's hands came to rest on his chest. "I heard Pike was looking for you. I had to warn you. You could have been seen." "I was careful." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Besides, I have news that couldn't wait." Something in her voice made Heath pull back slightly to study her face. In the fading light, she looked both terrified and exhilarated. "I'm with child, Heath," she whispered. "Our child." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Heath had faced down gunfighters and rustlers, had survived Apache raids and the harshest desert storms, but nothing had ever struck him with such force as those 4 simple words. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Nancy nodded. 3 months gone. "Soon it will be impossible to hide." Heath ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Judge Marshall would kill him for sure now. The man had made it abundantly clear that his daughter was to marry Pike, a union that would consolidate the 2 largest ranches in the territory. A bastard grandchild fathered by a cowhand with nothing to his name but a horse and saddle would be an unforgivable scandal. "We need to leave," Heath said decisively. "Tonight. And go where? North, maybe Colorado or even Montana. I have a friend in Bozeman who could help us get settled." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "My father will hunt us down, you know he will. Not if we're careful, not if we're smart." Heath took her hands in his. "Nancy, I know this isn't the life you dreamed of. You deserve better than running away with a man who can barely provide for himself, let alone a wife and child." "I deserve to be with the man I love," she said firmly. "That's you, Heath Simmons, whether you're rich as Midas or poor as a church mouse." Their plan came together quickly. They would meet at midnight by the old oak tree where the stage road forked north. Nancy would bring what few possessions she could carry without raising suspicion, along with whatever money she could discreetly take from her father's safe. Heath would have the horses ready. As midnight approached, Heath waited anxiously at the appointed spot, two saddled horses stamping restlessly in the cool night air. He checked his pocket watch for the dozenth time. Nancy was late, and every minute increased the knot of dread in his stomach. Finally, he heard the soft sound of approaching hoofbeats. Nancy emerged from the darkness, riding side saddle on her mare, a small bundle tied behind her. "I was beginning to worry," Heath said, helping her dismount. "Father had guests for dinner. I couldn't get away until they left." She was breathless, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I brought what I could." She handed him a small leather pouch that jingled with coins. "This will get us far enough away to start fresh," Heath said, securing the money in his saddlebag. He helped Nancy mount the horse he'd prepared for her, a gentle sorrel mare that would provide a smoother ride for her condition. They rode hard through the night, following the stagecoach road north until dawn began to color the eastern sky. Only then did they permit themselves a brief rest, watering the horses at a small creek while sharing a meager breakfast of jerky and hardtack. "We should reach Flagstaff in 3 days if we keep this pace," Heath said, studying the crude map he'd purchased from a traveling peddler months earlier. Nancy nodded, her face pale with exhaustion. "And then we catch the train east to Denver and from there north to Montana." They continued their journey, staying off the main roads when possible, camping in hidden draws and canyons. At night, beneath a canopy of stars, they would talk about their future, the home they would build, the life they would create for their child. On the third day, as they approached a narrow pass between two mesas, Heath sensed something was wrong. The birds had gone quiet, and there was a tension in the air that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "Nancy," he said quietly, "ride behind me and be ready to run if I tell you." She didn't question him, having learned to trust his instincts during their time together on her father's ranch. They proceeded cautiously, Heath's hand resting on his revolver. The ambush came suddenly, 3 riders emerging from behind a cluster of boulders, rifles raised. Heath recognized them immediately, Judge Marshall's ranch hands. "That's far enough, Simmons," called out the lead man, a weathered cowboy named Jenkins. "The judge wants his daughter back." Heath positioned his horse to shield Nancy. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jenkins said, his rifle unwavering. "The judge said to bring Nancy back unharmed. He didn't say nothing about you." Heath could feel Nancy trembling behind him. "Run," he whispered to her. "Head for those trees and don't look back." "I won't leave you," she hissed. Before Heath could respond, Jenkins fired a warning shot that kicked up dust just in front of Heath's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing Heath from the saddle. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. Heath drew his revolver, Nancy screamed, and gunfire erupted from the rocks to their right, gunfire that wasn't aimed at them, but at Jenkins and his men. "Get down," Heath yelled, pulling Nancy from her horse and behind a large boulder. The firefight was brief but intense. When silence finally fell, Heath cautiously peered around their shelter. Jenkins and one of his companions lay motionless on the ground. The third man was nowhere to be seen. "Who?" Nancy began, but her question was answered as 4 riders emerged from the rocks, leading their horses. Heath tensed, his gun still drawn, until he recognized the leader, Noah Walsh, a fellow ranch hand who had often worked alongside Heath. "Figured you might need some help," Noah said, approaching with his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Judge has half the territory looking for you too." "How did you find us?" Heath asked, still suspicious. "Wasn't hard to guess which way you'd go." Noah glanced at Nancy. "Miss Marshall, you all right?" Nancy nodded, still shaken. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Walsh." "Don't thank me yet," Noah said grimly. "Judge has telegraphed ahead to every town between here and the Colorado border. There's a bounty on Heath's head, dead or alive." Heath felt his blood run cold. "How much?" $500. Nancy gasped. It was enough money to tempt even the most honest man in these hard times. "You can't keep going north," Noah continued. "Every bounty hunter and lawman will be looking for you." "Then where?" Heath asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Noah exchanged glances with his companions. "West, to California. I've got family in a little town near Sacramento." They'll help you get settled until things cool down." Heath looked at Nancy, whose hand had instinctively moved to her stomach, protecting their unborn child. "It's a long, hard journey across the desert. We don't have a choice," she said softly. "My father won't stop until he finds us." Noah and his men escorted them as far as the Colorado River, providing them with extra supplies and fresh horses. Before they parted ways, Noah pressed a letter into Heath's hand. "Give this to my cousin in Gold Creek," he said. "He'll see you right." The journey across the Mojave Desert was brutal, especially for Nancy in her condition. They traveled by night when possible, resting during the scorching daylight hours beneath whatever shade they could find. Water was scarce, and more than once they nearly ran dry, saved only by Heath's knowledge of hidden springs and seeps learned from his years of driving cattle across similar terrain. By the time they reached the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevada range, Nancy was visibly pregnant, her condition impossible to conceal. They had been traveling for nearly 2 months, and the strain was beginning to show on both of them. "Just a little further," Heath would encourage her each morning as they broke camp. "A few more days and we'll be in Gold Creek," but fate had other plans for them. As they navigated a steep mountain trail, Nancy's horse stumbled on loose shale, sending both horse and rider tumbling down a rocky embankment. Heath's heart stopped as he watched Nancy fall, her scream cut short as she hit the ground. He was off his horse in an instant, sliding down the slope to where she lay motionless among the rocks. "Nancy," he cried, gathering her in his arms. "Nancy, please." Her eyes fluttered open and she winced in pain. "The baby," she whispered, her hands clutching her rounded belly. "Heath, something's wrong." Heath had never felt so helpless in his life. They were miles from the nearest town with no doctor or midwife to help. Nancy's face had gone deathly pale and he could see blood staining her skirts. "Hold on," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." He fashioned a travois from branches and his bedroll, securing Nancy as comfortably as possible before beginning the agonizing journey down the mountain. The horse carrying Nancy moved at an excruciating slow pace, each step jostling her despite Heath's best efforts to create a smooth path. As dusk approached, Heath spotted smoke rising from a clearing below a cabin or small homestead. He offered a silent prayer of thanks as he guided the horses toward it. The cabin belonged to a middle-aged couple, the Morgans, who had left Missouri 5 years earlier to try their luck in the California gold fields. Though the gold had proved elusive, they had established a modest farm in the fertile valley. "My wife's in trouble," Heath explained breathlessly as Mr. Morgan met him in the yard. "She's with child and took a fall. She's bleeding, Mrs." Morgan, a stout woman with kind eyes, took charge immediately. "Bring her inside," she instructed. "Daniel, fetch clean water and towels." What followed were the longest hours of Heath's life. Banished to the front porch while Mrs. Morgan tended to Nancy, he paced like a caged mountain lion, flinching at every cry of pain that came from within the cabin. "First baby?" Mr. Morgan asked, offering Heath a cup of coffee laced with whiskey. Heath nodded mutely. "My Martha knows what she's doing," the older man assured him. "She helped birth half the babies in our county back home." As the night wore on, the cries from inside grew more frequent and intense. Heath felt utterly helpless, a feeling foreign to a man accustomed to solving problems with his hands and his wits. Finally, near dawn, a different cry pierced the air, the wailing of a newborn baby. Heath leapt to his feet, his heart pounding. Mrs. Morgan appeared at the door, her apron stained with blood but a smile on her tired face. "You have a daughter, Mr. Simmons, a beautiful, healthy daughter." Heath nearly collapsed with relief. "And Nancy? She's weak from blood loss, but she'll recover with rest and good care." Mrs. Morgan stepped aside. "You can see them now." Nancy lay propped up on pillows, her face ashen but her eyes bright as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in a patchwork quilt. She looked up as Heath entered, her smile transforming her exhausted features. "Heath," she whispered, "come meet your daughter." Heath approached cautiously, almost afraid to breathe. The baby was so small, her face red and wrinkled, a wisp of dark hair peeking from beneath the blanket. "Would you like to hold her?" Nancy asked. Heath froze, suddenly terrified. His hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, seemed too large and clumsy for something so delicate. "I don't know how," he confessed, his voice barely audible. Nancy's smile grew tender. "I'll show you," she said, carefully shifting the infant. "Support her head in the crook of your arm like this." With trembling hands, Heath accepted his daughter, cradling her awkwardly against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, yet somehow she felt like the most important weight he had ever carried. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his throat tight with emotion. The baby squirmed slightly, her tiny fingers flexing before curling into a fist. Heath was overcome with a fierce, protective love unlike anything he had ever experienced. "What shall we call her?" Nancy asked softly. Heath studied the tiny face, perfect in every detail. "Hope," he said after a moment, "because that's what she's given us." The Morgans insisted that Nancy and the baby remain with them until both were strong enough to travel. Days stretched into weeks as Nancy recovered from the difficult birth, and Heath found himself learning the basics of infant care under Mrs. Morgan's patient guidance. "Never thought I'd see a cowboy take to fatherhood so naturally, Mrs. Morgan remarked one evening as Heath walked the floor with Hope, singing softly to soothe her to sleep. "Nothing natural about it," Heath admitted. "I'm terrified I'll do something wrong every time I pick her up." "That's what makes you a good father," she replied wisely. "The ones who think they know everything are the ones to worry about." As October gave way to November, Heath realized they couldn't impose on the Morgans' hospitality much longer. Winter was approaching, and they needed to establish a home of their own before the heavy snows made travel impossible. Using Noah's letter of introduction, Heath rode into Gold Creek and met with Noah's cousin, Samuel Walsh, who owned the local mercantile. Samuel, a jovial man with Noah's same easy manner, welcomed Heath warmly. "Any friend of Noah's is a friend of mine," he declared. "And as it happens, I might have a solution to your housing problem." The solution was a small abandoned homestead about 3 miles outside of town, a simple 2-room cabin with a lean-to stable, situated on 20 acres of land that had reverted to the county after its previous owner had died without heirs. "It needs work," Samuel admitted as he showed Heath the property. "Roof leaks in a couple places and the chimney needs fixing, but the bones are good and the county assessor owes me a favor. I can help you file a claim." Heath surveyed the property, noting the nearby creek, the stand of pine trees that would provide firewood and building materials, and the small meadow where a vegetable garden could be planted come spring. "It's perfect," he said, already envisioning Nancy and Hope in the cozy cabin. "How much?" The price Samuel named was fair, especially with the reduced filing fee he'd arranged. Heath counted out the money from what remained of their savings, keeping just enough back to purchase supplies they would need for the winter. Over the next 2 weeks, Heath worked from dawn until dusk repairing the cabin, determined to make it comfortable for Nancy and the baby. Samuel sent men from town to help with the heavier work of replacing roof beams and rebuilding the chimney, refusing payment beyond Heath's promise to help with the spring cattle drive. By the time Heath brought Nancy and Hope to their new home, the cabin had been transformed. A new stone fireplace dominated one wall, curtains sewn by Mrs. Morgan hung at the windows, and a handcrafted cradle, a gift from Mr. Morgan, waited in the corner of what would be their bedroom. "It's beautiful," Nancy said, tears in her eyes as she took in their new home. "Our own place at last." That first winter tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The snows came early and heavy, often leaving them isolated for days at a time. Hope developed a worrying cough that kept them awake for 3 nights straight before it finally eased. Food stores ran low in February, forcing Heath to hunt in the bitter cold. But there were moments of profound joy too, Hope's first smile, the quiet evenings by the fire with Nancy in his arms, the sense of accomplishment as Heath mastered new skills like making furniture and smoking meat. They were building a life together, one day at a time. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Heath hired on at the Walsh Ranch, earning steady wages that allowed them to buy a milk cow and chickens. Nancy planted a garden and took in sewing work from town, her skilled needlework quickly earning her a reputation among Gold Creek's more prosperous families. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, Heath marveled at how naturally Nancy had taken to motherhood, despite having been raised with servants to attend her every need. She seemed to instinctively know how to soothe Hope's cries, when to worry about a fever and when it would pass on its own, how to coax a smile even on the fussiest days. "How do you always know what she needs?" Heath asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Hope toddle after fireflies in the gathering dusk. Nancy smiled. "I don't, not always. I just try different things until something works. You make it look so easy." "It isn't easy," she admitted, "but it's worth every difficult moment." As Hope approached her second birthday, news reached them that changed everything. Samuel received a letter from Noah containing a shocking update. Judge Marshall had died suddenly of a heart attack. With his death, the bounty on Heath had been withdrawn, and Nancy was now the sole heir to the Marshall ranch and fortune. "We could go back," Heath said as they discussed the news that night. "The ranch would be yours. Hope would grow up with every advantage." Nancy was quiet for a long moment, watching Hope sleep in her little bed that Heath had crafted for her second birthday. "What do you want to do?" she finally asked. Heath considered the question carefully. "Part of me wants to say we should stay here where we've built something that's truly ours. But I can't deny that the Marshall Ranch would provide security for Hope that we might never manage on our own." "The ranch was never a happy place for me," Nancy said softly. "My father ruled it like a kingdom with fear rather than respect." She turned to face Heath. "But it could be different now. We could make it different." The journey back to Arizona was far easier than their flight had been. They traveled by train most of the way, Hope enchanted by the novelty of the steam engine and the changing landscape outside the windows. By the time they reached Silver Creek, word of their return had preceded them. Sheriff Thompson met them at the station, his face grave. "There's something you should know," he said after greeting them. "Randall Pike has taken up residence at the Marshall Ranch. Claims he has a contract signed by your father promising him the property if you didn't return within 2 years of the judge's death." Nancy's face hardened. "My father would never have left his property to Randall Pike. Any such document is a forgery." "That may be," the sheriff agreed, "but he's got possession for now, and in these parts that counts for a lot." Heath felt the familiar weight of his revolver at his hip. "Then we'll just have to change that." The confrontation at the Marshall Ranch unfolded not with gunfire, as Heath had feared, but with the unexpected intervention of the law. Judge Marshall's attorney, a meticulous man named Harrison, had kept duplicate copies of all important documents, including the judge's will. The will clearly left everything to Nancy, with no mention of Randall Pike. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the sheriff's deputies, Pike had no choice but to leave, though not before promising that Heath would regret the day he'd ever set eyes on Nancy Marshall. "Let him threaten," Nancy said as they stood on the porch of her childhood home, watching Pike and his men ride away. "This is our home now." The transition wasn't without its challenges. Many of the ranch hands were loyal to the old ways and viewed Heath with suspicion. The neighboring ranchers, who had done business with Judge Marshall for decades, were hesitant to accept Heath as an equal. But slowly, through hard work and fair dealing, Heath earned their respect. He introduced new breeding stock that improved the quality of their herd. He negotiated better prices with the railroad for their cattle. And perhaps most significantly, he treated the ranch hands with dignity and fairness, something they had rarely experienced under Judge Marshall's rule. Nancy, meanwhile, transformed the imposing Marshall house into a true home. The dark, heavy furniture was replaced with lighter pieces. Windows that had been perpetually shuttered were opened to let in sunlight. The garden, long neglected, bloomed again under her care. Hope thrived in her new environment, growing from a toddler into a curious, adventurous child who followed Heath around the ranch, asking endless questions about the cattle, the horses, and the land. By the time she was 5, she could ride as well as most of the ranch hands, her natural affinity for horses a source of pride for Heath. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons: spring calving, summer roundups, fall cattle drives, and winter planning for the year ahead. The Marshall Ranch, renamed the Double S for Simmons, prospered under Heath and Nancy's stewardship. On the evening of Hope's 6th birthday, as the celebration wound down and guests departed, Heath found Nancy standing alone on the porch, gazing at the sunset painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she replied, leaning into him. "Remember that first night in the Morgans' cabin when you held Hope for the first time?" Heath chuckled. "I was terrified I'd drop her. You whispered that you didn't know how, and I told you I'd show you." Nancy turned to face him, her eyes soft with memory. "Now look at you, you're the one showing me how to be brave, how to build something lasting, how to love without holding back." "We've shown each other," Heath corrected gently, "every step of the way." From inside the house came the sound of Hope's laughter, bright and clear. Heath and Nancy shared a smile, the kind that needed no words to express the depth of what they felt. "Mama, Papa," Hope called from the doorway. "Come see what Uncle Noah brought me." They turned together, hand in hand, to join their daughter. The sun's last rays caught the silver in Nancy's chestnut hair and highlighted the laugh lines around Heath's eyes, evidence of a life richly lived, with all its trials and triumphs. As they stepped back into the warmth of their home, Heath reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from desperate fugitives to respected ranchers, from inexperienced young lovers to partners who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. The cowboy who once didn't know how to hold his infant daughter now knew the most important thing of all: that love, like any worthwhile endeavor, wasn't about having all the answers from the start. It was about learning together, day by day, through challenge and joy alike. And as he watched Hope demonstrate her new harmonica, her small face scrunched in concentration, Heath felt a fullness in his heart that no amount of gold or land could ever provide: the simple, profound blessing of a family built on love, trust, and the courage to forge a path together through the wild frontier of life.